The chair of IEEE, the Society for Social Implications of Technology. Greg Adamson also spoke at the Singularity Summit last year. It was really good. I'll leave you to Greg now because we haven't really got enough time for me to do long introductions. So, okay, thank you, Greg.
Can I ask a question? Oh, wait, you released the slide, sorry.
So what I want to speak about today is technology and social control, and the reason this is interesting to me in relation to the topic of this conference is that if technology is inherently centralizing and inherently increases control, then any further development we make over the next 20, 30, 70 years is simply going to be a one-track path into a worse and worse world. And I don't believe that's the case, but what I want to do is present a little bit of background and some thinking around why I think we have an opportunity. We have threats, but we also have an opportunity. Just to begin with, I want to describe the problem, which the first writer here doesn't actually consider to be a problem. This is Max Weber, as known for his work on bureaucracy, and this was published in 1922, a couple of years after he died, where he spoke about the primary source of the superiority of bureaucratic administration lies in the role of technical knowledge, which, through the development of modern technology and business methods in the production of goods, has become completely indispensable. So he's talking about bureaucracy, which he considers to be a good thing, as being enabled by modern technology. And in 1922, or when he actually wrote those words himself a few years before that, was a view that could be sustained more than later in last century. I've then picked out three critics of this view. The first of these is Norbert Wiener, who talked about and he was a mathematician, an engineer and a scientist, and he developed some important work himself, particularly in the area of cybernetics. And he said that we don't have the choice of suppressing these technical developments, but what he saw was the problem that it would make a contribution to the concentration of power. And he made the comment that concentration of power, by its very existence, is always concentrated in the hands of the most unscrupulous. So it's not the unscrupulous people who create the power, but the unscrupulous people who grab for power, which is created by the technologies and their centralizing tendencies. Jacques Ellul, a Catholic philosopher who wrote just after the Second World War on a number of topics, and was strongly critical of all technology and all of what he called technique, even things such as the modern justice system, said that technical centralization is one of the major realities of our time. The idea of effecting decentralization while maintaining technical progress is purely utopian. Now, in his case, he said it's not individuals who create bad situations. It's bad situations that are created inevitably by technology, which is inevitably centralizing. And just to repeat, he said it's utopian to consider you can have non-centralizing technology. And finally, I'll quote from the US President Eisenhower in his final speech before he left office. And he talked about the changes in the industrial military posture. And it was Eisenhower who termed the phrase military-industrial complex, which talked about the very, very close association between the development of technology, the development of large corporations, the development of the military, and the fact that all these things were very, very tightly bound together in a way that was pretty well out of control of any sort of democratic government process. And he made the point that in his view, the solitary inventor tinkering in his workshop has been overshadowed by task forces of scientists in laboratories and testing fields. Public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific technological elite. So these are very negative views. These comments are all very negative in their own way. And that for me that's the presentation of the problem. And these are all honest people honestly describing the things that they're worried about. with the exception of Max Weber, who's enthusiastic about the things he's enthusiastic about. So that was the 20th century. Most of those quotes were directly after the Second World War, and after World War II, the dream of bigger and better through technology had a bit of a battering, particularly after the effects of technology and what technology achieved or what technology did during the Second World War, especially the conclusion of that war with the dropping of atomic bombs. What I'd assert is that from that period, and this was the situation in 1940, 1950, 1960. It was very centralising. What I'd assert is that there were tendencies within those technologies that were developing at the same time and became quite strong in the 70s, 80s and 90s, and some of the speakers we've heard from in the last few speeches have emphasised aspects of this. And what I want to look at is elements of technology development in that period that undermined the centralising tendency of technology itself. And I want to look at this from four aspects: commercial, intellectual property, technical, and media. This isn't meant to be every way, but just when I put all the examples down, these were the groups that they sort of naturally slotted into. Just briefly, this paper is one of a series of papers I'm doing on the relationship between technology and society. That's the one in green up the top. I've also looked at a number of other things. And the main purpose of my research is to understand why, with all the great technology we have in the world and all the smart people we have working on technology in the world today and over the last hundreds of years, the result we get is so poor. If people disagree with me and think we live in a perfect world that's been enabled by wonderful technology, please introduce me to your universe. But I just see time after time that opportunities for technology to make the world an improved place are lost or squandered. So to begin with, I'll look at commercial factors. And what I want to look at for each of these is what I call a centralizing, a concentrating tendency, and then what I call a diversifying tendency. Now, economies of scale, people will have heard the phrase, the network effect. And please jump in at any time during this presentation if either you can't understand something, if you disagree with something, or if you just want to get me to amplify on something. The network effect is thought of as a modern phenomenon, but it was actually identified by Theodore Vail in 1908, and he was the head of AT&T, the American telephone company. And what he explained there was the more people you had using telephones, the more the telephone system itself was effective. So this idea that if you had 20 different companies running independent telephone systems that weren't connected together, and you took all of those 20 and you combined them into a single company, or more precisely, given that this was ATT before the First World War, using I think the Chicago Chamber of Commerce described ATT as a grinding, ruthless monopoly. So using that approach, you basically ground your opposition into the dust and took over all their customers. You built a business which was more valuable than the individual. You gained synergy from combining those companies together. It was more than just the sum of the benefits for those 20 existing companies. So that's economy, and when people think about the centralizing aspects of technology, it's often the economies of scale that they're talking about. Secondly, from a commercial aspect, there's the tendency for large companies to swallow small companies. I just gave the example of Bell, but it's of AT&T, but it's a widespread feature of commercial development in the last couple of hundred years. A third area is the brain drain. Basically, large companies running big technologies can afford to buy everybody, and small companies can't afford to keep in the game. And the fourth area under these commercial factors is the rising cost of new development, which is that the large companies, and if you look at the work of someone like Schumpeter in the 1930s, a very interesting and good economist, who said basically innovation will occur in large corporations, small companies can't afford it. Now, so that was the common view mid last century. What we've seen since then, things have definitely become more complicated. And on the commercial side, I'll give these four responses. In relation to the economies of scale, what we've actually seen through Moore's Law and the massive introduction of new approaches, new technologies, new channels, new inventions, is what I call a dense ecosystem of solutions. So now if you want to do something with the technology, you don't have one choice, you have hundreds of choices. Not every problem can be addressed with hundreds of choices. So for example, if you have a particular illness which no medicine can treat, and then somebody comes along with a solution to that, you've only got one choice. But by and large, the sort of problems we're talking about, clean water, clean air, coping with the effects of a greener approach to the production of energy, these sort of things, they have and just managing organisations, producing information, running those many aspects of society the technology is part of today. You have many choices. So you don't need just one telephone system. You've got lots of, even if I want to communicate with you, I can use my telephone, or I can use those many other channels that people have spoken about today. The thing about large swallows small, and I'm not suggesting here for a moment that there's an equality in these things. Some of them are very much large versus small. So it's still David and Goliath in many of these. But the second one, talking about appropriate technology, the idea that large companies provide the best solutions by providing the major technology, the leading technology of the day, that sort of went out the window in the 1960s when people understood that a lot of large technology projects fail, and a lot of large technology projects fail to deliver on their promise, and that the best solution in many circumstances is the most appropriate technology, not the most complicated technology. So that sort of spun the whole large swallows small thing on its head a little bit. And you see, as I repeatedly say, things are more complicated today. The third one, the brain drain. Well, that's you look at China and America today. You look at the figures for people going to the United States to complete their PhDs. Partly, it's just really hard to get into the United States now, because the United States has taken a particular decision about how friendly they're going to be to visitors. Whether it's people turning up for one day or people deciding to go and study there for a few years and then move there. But a lot of people now are either leaving the US to go back to India, many people who came from India, or they're studying in China, or they're studying in other places, because there are many countries in the world which were previously considered to be underdeveloped or undeveloped, that now have reached critical mass in terms of the knowledge that they have and the ability they have to innovate. The fourth one there is on the rising cost of development. We have many examples of non-commercial production. There have been the open source movement, the free software movement, and so on, and many examples of non-commercial production. My favourite is AT&T and Unix. I think this is absolutely wonderful. AT&T, as everybody knows, is a telephone company. The big telephone company was AT&T. The big software company was IBM. That's how it was. IBM produced software, AT&T produced telephones. So how come the basis of everything that we like today and everything that's successful today is sort of a spin-off from Unix? How did that happen? Unix is produced by AT&T. AT&T isn't a software company. What happened here was that AT&T and IBM sort of, AT&T was not allowed to produce software for commercial purposes based on a legal agreement they reached in the 1950s. So what they did was IBM and AT&T sort of fought around the fringes for ownership of certain things and new developments and stuff like that. And AT&T, in my view, and I can't prove this, but in my view, AT&T just decided to stuff IBM a little bit by producing this software, which was pretty good, and then releasing it virtually for free to all the universities, which suddenly meant everybody who studied software, what they were going to study, they were going to pay IBM for their IBM systems, or they were going to use this free stuff that was handed out by the telephone company. So that's things that are expected don't happen. and haven't been happening in technology. Some intellectual property ones. We have the monopoly of hardware. This is, anyone here who's had any sort of look at the history of telephones, 500 patent battles fought over something like 40 years for Bell to assert his ownership, his invention of the telephone. Now, the truth is, he didn't invent the telephone. The original patent he had wasn't a telephone. The thing he invented was a multiplexing system for telegraphs, for telegraphic messages. That's what he invented. He invented a method of multiplexing telegraph signals. And he called it a telephone and pretended that it was used to talk to people. But that it's wonderful to read this stuff because it just sort of blows up any theory about a nice steady development of technology protected by intellectual property and the inventors get rewarded and all this sort of crap. Anyway, so there was the monopoly of hardware thing, the monopoly of software. It's very common for IBM or Microsoft or others to have 90% market share in their particular niches. The monopoly of content through the anti-piracy campaign and stuff like that. So what's happened on these fronts in the last few decades? Well, firstly, we've seen some of the last couple of presentations have provided some very interesting and good information about the open source hardware space, and I think that's very important. But before we have that, and even independent of that, the fact that this thing is commodified, so it costs hundreds of millions or billions of dollars to produce a new CPU chip, but once they're produced, they're just produced in such large numbers, and the technology is moving so fast that you can now, for $1 you can now buy something that's more powerful than any computer that existed in the 1950s. It just becomes commodified. So the idea that someone's going to hang on to that control and force us to have big centralized computers because CPUs are so expensive to produce, it just hasn't worked that way. It's become, like there are billions of these things, as the previous speaker said. They're off the shelf. You can now build you read through the list of the top 500 supercomputers in the world. What are they made of? Is anybody out there making new CPUs? Yes, the Chinese are producing one because they don't trust the Americans. I think very wisely, they don't trust the American CPUs not to have backdoors in them, which I'm sure they have. But apart from that, no one's really. If you want to produce a supercomputer, you go and buy a whole bunch of Xbox chips, and you put them together in a data center. That's how you produce a supercomputer. You don't have to be the company that's specialized in producing supercomputers for the last 100 years, and you've got all that knowledge that no one else, and all that intellectual property that no one else can copy. On software, the free software, free as in free speech, not as in free beer, as Richard Stallman always says, is a wonderful alternative. That didn't exist 50 years ago. You didn't have something like that. You had a bit of hacker culture in a sense in the universities that were actually producing the computers themselves, but in terms of access for the public, or people who wanted to experiment and stuff, it just wasn't there. And even the anti-piracy stuff, I'm just waiting in. It's at a certain point, the intellectual property owners are going to realise that if they lock things down sufficiently to have 100% control over everybody who watches a Hollywood movie, that is simply going to create a non-Hollywood movie industry. That's what happened. That's how Hollywood was formed. Hollywood was formed because the mafia who ran the intellectual property control over the cameras, who were based on the east coast of the United States, based in New Jersey, who would go to a film set and smash up the equipment of filmmakers who weren't paying their intellectual property tributes. They escaped. They went over to Hollywood, which was the other side of the country, and the mafia from New Jersey couldn't get over to Hollywood to smash up the cameras and the gear. That's how Hollywood was created. If Hollywood in turn locks everything down, then people will escape somewhere else. I like that little bit of history. Technical factors. We have technology centralisation, and if you look at the architecture from steam power to nuclear power, this is very centralising. So with steam power, you have what's called a prime mover. You've got a big machine that's producing energy and turning a thing that then has a whole bunch of leather straps attached to it, and each of these is then connected to a little piece of metalworking machinery or a little piece of something that's producing cloth or something like that. And you've got all these little machines, and because you've got one prime mover and you've got hundreds and hundreds of workers who are using the energy from this prime mover, and they've all got to be connected to the belts, you have to have a big factory. And you had no choice, absolutely no choice, to have a big to have a big mechanized factory where you weren't using human labor anymore. That was it was centralizing. Nuclear power, in the 1950s people talked about having nuclear power coffee pots, but there are certain problems with that. The security issue amongst others, and also just the technology limitations. Nuclear power was very centralizing. Steam power was very centralizing. Electrical power wasn't. It started off very centralised, but from about the 1920s, people suddenly realised you don't have to just replicate the steam power model. You can actually take these motors and you can make them smaller and smaller and smaller and stick them on drills and hand tools, and then you can make them tiny and tiny and stick them everywhere today, or in the 1940s or 50s. And so that was the original. There was the architecture issue. The next one, the technology complexity. Large companies have the experience to do a really good job and provide really good stuff which doesn't fail, and I'll address that in a moment. And the third one is the product functionality. Market leaders can improve faster than followers. So what happened in those spaces? Firstly, architecture. The internet removes the centralized requirement. It just does away with it. How does it do that? And this is the second one, the robust systems from unreliable components. Paul Barron's purpose when he invented packet switching was to overcome a weakness in the US phone system, not surprisingly, that it was a centralized system which a couple of nuclear bombs in a nuclear war would have been able to completely destroy. When I say two, I mean one on that location and one on that location, the whole American telephone system would have been gone. This is in the mind of the war planners. So he said, I want something that's completely fault tolerant. I want something where we can build a robust system out of flaky parts. Anything that's left of the phone system after nuclear bombs drop on it. And he created packet switching, and the reason he did that is it's all interesting and stuff like that, but I won't talk about that now. That completely turned upside down the concept that the way to build things better and better and better is to make them more and more and more reliable and more and more and more robust. You didn't have to do that. You just had to put it together from lots of bits and make sure that and have a design that addressed the unreliability factor. And the third one here, just to jump back, I've got to say, Schumpeter had a view that large companies innovate. That's actually not true. Large companies have the capacity to innovate. Small companies innovate. So if you do studies of where innovation comes from over the last 100 years, you look at who has the patents, who developed various things. All of the studies on this show that it's by having smaller companies coming along with a bright idea and grabbing hold of enough capital and then innovating. That's where innovation comes from. The large companies buy patents and sit on them. That's what the large companies do. They've got the resources to maintain their monopoly, and that's. Schumpeter mistakenly thought that because they had the capacity to innovate, they would innovate. But Michael Porter, who's I don't know if people follow the work of Michael Porter, and he's known as he's the best business theorist around today. He's shown very clearly that it's the smaller companies that innovate. So back to this point, disruptive technologies, market leaders. So the last point here, market leaders can improve faster than followers. That's true, but what happens is another phenomenon, which is also very interesting, which is market leaders innovate and then go past the point where they're meeting their customers' needs. They keep on producing stuff that's better and better and better, and at a certain point, if a customer has a word processor that's got 50% more functions than they'll ever possibly use, and then the company adds another 150% of functions, you've actually reached the point. You've gone past the point where adding more provides value, and so therefore then someone can come along with a much smaller budget and just produce one with about 100% of the functions that people normally need and give it away for free. So that's and Christensen identified in a book called The Innovator's Dilemma, based on the experience of the disk drive industry in the 1990s. And the last one of these I'm looking at is media factors, and I'll move through this quickly. So the idea that television's the perfect medium. Television is obviously a concentrating technology because it's a broadcast. Broadcast technologies, by definition, have a centralizing aspect. The media industry production costs $1 million for a TV episode, $100 million or more for a film, for a standard film. The communication channels cost, if you want to get into the business, in the early 90s they were looking at providing providing companies with access to television channels, and they were looking at it was going to cost $100,000 to sort of have a storefront on one of these television as they were looking at generalizing more and more television channels. And the feature richness, high definition television with hundreds of channels. We then have the alternatives to that. Who cares about television anymore? My son's 25. He hasn't watched a television program in 5 years. So what's happened to the gold standard, the perfect model, the television? It's sort of all fallen to pieces. And the fact that there are so many different channels just changes their reality. Sorry about the spelling here, it's meant to be O'Reilly. The peer-to-peer distribution of information and content production, the whole of Web 2 just changes that media industry approach. Compared to $100,000, internet channel costs are negligible. Compared to anything, you could probably, someone who's got a vague idea of what they want to do can probably walk into a library, get hold of a free internet access, get a free account somewhere, get them to provide them with some free hosting and put up their little web page. And that's a fully blown web page, not just a Facebook page. And feature richness, how do you compare 100 channels of television with millions of pages, blogs, videos on the internet and so on? It's just the game has changed. So, in conclusion, what I'd say is commercial considerations definitely tend to favour centralisation of technology. But the technology today and the technology over the last 50 years has provided an abundance of options that balance out those commercial considerations. The internet in particular has taken the cost of ubiquity near to zero. So if I wanted to conceive of distributing water purification in Melbourne, if I wanted to say, instead of having a small number of large water purifying plants, I wanted to have hundreds of water purifying plants all over Melbourne. 20 years ago I couldn't have done that because every one of them would have had to be staffed. Today, the infrastructure's there. I can put a sensor network out there that tells me when any of those water purification plants goes beyond some limits or comes up with some sort of alert. And a knowledgeable person can then travel to that site and fix it up. That can now happen in any way you can possibly imagine with wireless internet. And that has just completely changed the whole idea of needing huge plants doing lots of stuff with lots of experts sitting there, and by implication a very centralised technology model. The ubiquitous communication channels create a new concept of information production, as I mentioned, and finally, protecting this. This is a point that I don't hear of very often. People tend to think that the internet just sort of came along and it's great. The internet didn't just come along. The internet was an accident of. The internet is the first communication medium which has come along in the last 200 years. That is, since the French Revolution. It's the first one where we had mass uptake before we had commercialization. In every other communication medium, we've had a commercialization process which has gone through and chopped all the rough edges off it, has introduced control, has made it highly regulated. So the movie industry, the telephone, the telegraph, the mobile telephony, sound recording, everything you can imagine of in the last 200 years, FM radio, AM radio, all of those, they've all had commercialization before they had mass uptake. The internet had mass uptake first before commercialization, and that's what's made it very open. But that's not going to stay. If we don't make sure that we make that a priority to keep it open, particularly as we move into IPv6 and as other things occur in the next decades under issues of national security or for whatever other reason, that could go, that could be lost. So I'll just finish on this slide. The SSIT is part of IEEE, a 400,000 member professional body. We do a bunch of stuff. We hold a bunch of meetings. Some new things we're doing. We're just starting an intellectual property blog, intellectual property and other issues through our committee in Sydney. We're setting up a Facebook-based student group. We've got a couple of conferences coming up. We've got a conference on social implications of technology for the Asian region in Singapore late next year. And then finally, in 2014, we're organising a commemoration for Dr. Norbert Wiener, who was the founder of cybernetics, who I mentioned earlier, who had some wonderful, wonderful insights into the social implications of technology, but has basically dropped off the radar, and we're trying to raise his profile and bring him back into public conversation. So I know I was heading towards dinner there, and people didn't want to interrupt me because they're hungry, maybe. But any questions?
Someone said that hyperlinks subvert hierarchies. Do you agree with that? Hyperlinks subvert hierarchies. Just a quote. Anybody got any questions?
Seeing as I'm Carol, I'll ask a question. If you think that trends are changing, moving from centralization to decentralization, who do you think is losing power and who do you think is gaining power?
I very carefully haven't evaluated the power in all of those slides. I've said tendency, countervailing tendency. I haven't said I haven't described the respective power, and in some of them they're still very, very unequal. I would say the areas that are losing power are the areas that had assumed, for various reasons, had assumed power and then held on to it without any justification. So if you look at, say, the sound recording industry, there was a fight between the intellectual property owners and the radio stations in the late 1920s. The intellectual property owners went on strike for 2 years and refused to allow the radio stations to play any of their songs, and the radio stations then caved and agreed to pay the intellectual property owners for the privilege of playing their songs. That was a fight, And they won the intellectual property owners won that fight, and then for decades after that, they operated on the assumption that that was their divine right, to be paid by everybody under all circumstances for material which they controlled, which they hadn't actually produced. Because the intellectual property owners don't stand up there with a guitar and produce a great song. You know, they just control that. So I'd say the lazy owners have lost out. It's too early to say who's won. Who's won?
Could you just discuss a little bit about the new internet filters, specifically the Australian one?
Yeah. Okay. Censorship is the debate on censorship goes back thousands of years. The internet, the discussion of internet filtering is simply the latest version of the latest form of the debate. The difficulty for those arguing in favour of internet censorship, well, firstly, the people arguing in favour of censorship in general in the online world are as inconsistent as those arguing for it in the past have ever been. So the lack of the censorship of online gaming position held by the government for a long time was just irrational. I'm not sure whether that's been changed, but the main advocate of it disappeared off the scene. So the debate goes on. The arguments are highly emotive. Some of them are thought out. Most of them aren't thought out. And we have this thing goes round and round and makes great newspaper headlines. The internet is very difficult to censor. Paul Barron did a very, very wonderful job when he designed packet switching. And so I would say it's a fight. It's an important fight. It's just like there's a new proposal that's gone up that came from the Senate, I think, that said pornography in analysing pornography, artistic merit should not be a consideration. So Michelangelo's David is just pornography. I mean, my stomach turns when I see Michelangelo's David. It's just disgusting. Artistic merit? No, we're not going to consider that. There's a lot of stupidity. We have to be careful. We have to. There is a lot of stupidity, so it's possible to argue those points point by point and defeat those points point by point. But we can't afford to be blasé about it. It's censors who want to control what we think and see and read. They'll always be wanting to control it.
Thanks, great talk. Wanted to ask, because you were splitting the two in kind of past and kind of what's happening now, is there a time gap or a growth relationship between each one of those scenarios that you presented up on the different slides? And is it too far-reaching to look at what happens when there's a national broadband network? Will it change much, or will that growth period happen faster or longer?
Yeah. So that's a very interesting question. I haven't read the 7,000 pages of the report, so I don't know what the detail of it is, and I haven't even read a high-level description of it. I just don't know what I don't know whether we're looking at I don't know what the model is for whether it goes to the curb or the area or the house or whatever. It could definitely be argued that that's a centralizing tendency, the NBN. It'll really depend on the small print, and I think there could be some disputes along the way with that. I wouldn't really. But the other weird thing is that in relation to that, the idea that you could create a single national broadband structure that has a single set of international connections and that has a single point of failure where some accident could occur, someone could dig through a cable or something like that. That's pretty well out of fashion. So that's actually another problem with the centralised model these days. Governments tend to not want to create national infrastructure with single points of failure. But on the other hand, single points of control are very likely. We certainly saw single points of control in Northern Africa with the switching off of the internet in a number of countries for hours or days earlier this year. That's my feel about that is that if it turned out that that's the way things were looking, like there was a single point of control, and if that was exercised in any sort of way, we have so many other options. I'm just thinking back to the bulletin board movement of the late 1980s. My personal view is that if the internet, say if the ISO model had been successful of those protocols we were looking at early in the last talk, if the ISO model had been successful, or if a combination of the ISO model and the ATM-based information superhighway had been successful, we then would have seen the growth of a grassroots network from the bulletin board background intersecting with the some aspects of TCP/IP, and even then we wouldn't have had the very highly controlled information superhighway which was being imagined in the late 1980s. So I think we've got enough. I think the dense ecosystem of options exists for us today, and the NBN won't do it. Obviously, if the NBN is a large and effective piece of infrastructure, that'd be fantastic. We will see. In terms of time difference, it's not just a delay. I think we actually saw a level of sophistication from about the 1930s. If you look at Mumford's writings in the 1930s on the various waves of technology, I think he talks about the early technology, then the iron and power-based technologies, and then I can't remember what he called the later part. But I think there has been really, technology itself has taken a leap forward sometime in the first half of the 20th century that enabled all the stuff I've described to occur. It wasn't just that each of those centralizing things then had a countervailing tendency 20 years later. It was that from 1950, everything was just up in the air. It was possible to subvert any of those centralized approaches because the technology had grown so sophisticated.
Thank you very much, Greg. That was a great talk.